Hello and welcome to A Call to Arms, a series of interviews discussing a range of issues relevant to defence with UK practitioners at the top of their profession. I'm Andy Young and I work for the Military Sciences Research Group here at the Royal United Services Institute on Whitehall. Each month, I will host an interview with a senior leader from within the UK Armed Forces, exploring the issues that face defence today and tomorrow, giving you the inside story on how the military orientates itself to face future challenges. This series is kindly supported by Airbus, a company that employs 12,500 people around the UK and contributes £7 billion to UK GDP. This month on A Call to Arms, we talk to Major General Tom Copinger-Symes, Director of Strategy and Military Digitisation. Late of the Rifles and formerly of the Royal Green Jackets, Major General Copinger-Symes has held command at battalion, brigade and division. In August 2019, he took up his current post to accelerate Defence's digital transformation, and subsequently, he has also taken on both the strategy and digital transformation portfolios. Major General Copinger-Symes, thank you very much for joining us today. Before we go into the meat of the interview, would you be able to just give us the why, the what, and the how of Defence Digital?
Yeah, sure. So good to be with you today, Andrew. Thanks. So Defence Digital, relatively new organisation, a couple of years old now, and occupies two areas, really. At one level, it's a high-level budget within Strategic Command. And very importantly, also is the delivery agent for the vast majority of Defence's digital capability. At another level, it's one of the cross-cutting functions, I guess, with a capital F across Defence, so like HR or commercial or finance. And again, sits within Strategic Command for that, but also then has a strong dotted line up to head office. And my boss, Charlie Forty, the CIO, sort of dual reports to Commander UK Strategic Command and the second permanent undersecretary to achieve that sort of dual reporting purpose. So I guess that's the what. The why, I suppose, in abstract terms, the why is to equip Defence with the sorts of digital capability in the hands of users. That's important because this is not a theoretical discussion. You know, things change when people get a new thing in their hands. That could be a Windows 10 laptop. That's the current trick for everybody in Defence, you know, whether civil servant or uniform, or it could be a new battle space widget, or of course it could be an important bit of middleware that's not seen by anybody, but that vastly improves our ability to share data and move data and exploit it. So that's broadly our why, to put game-changing technological capability in the hands of our users. The who is a really interesting point, probably why I've saved it to last. So Charlie Forty, the CIO, is a sort of 40-year industry chap, largely in extractive industries, BP and elsewhere. And he's recruited a very diverse senior leadership team. And I say diverse, you know, I mean that in the sort of formal view of diverse, you know, protected characteristics. We're about 50-50 gender split, which is quite rare in Defence and probably the wider public sector. But it's also very diverse in terms of background, experience, cognitive diversity, and so on. So I'd say, I haven't done the sums on this, we'd be about a third industry, previous industry folk. So, for instance, Christine Maxwell, our CISO, our security officer, has come from an industry background. Caroline Bellamy, our chief data officer, in fact, Defence's first chief data officer, has come from an industry background. And Phil Jones, who runs the delivery organization, formerly ISS, now Service Delivery and Operations. Again, Phil's come from an industry background. And they're complemented then by a bunch of civil servants with sort of either long Defence or other government department experience. So, you know, Claire Fry, our Director of Functional Integration, is a long-term Defence civil servant. Tim Andrews, our Chief Finance Officer, would be the same. And then somebody like John Fitzpatrick, our Director of Digital Enablement, has come in from a mixed industry and public sector career, but equally from the MOJ and elsewhere. And then, of course, you've got a couple of soldiers, sailors and airmen in the mix. So myself, General Rich Spencer, who's one of the delivery directors down in STO, or indeed somebody like Nick Washer, Rear Admiral Nick Washer, who runs our ops setup. So sorry to go on so long, but it's quite important that we're sort of getting that diversity of view getting some industry streetwise smarts involved, as well as hopefully a strong enough link back to, the user, the soldier, the sailor, the pilot, or whatever, and also that connection into wider defence through the civil service.
Talking about diversity in these kind of roles and going beyond the traditional version into the cognitive diversity that all those backgrounds brings, I think that is something that we miss so often in the military, because we are trained to think in a certain way, we're developed to think a certain way, all of our PME. And it was actually described to me the other day that if you think about a military staff hive mind, it's much more like AI, in that when you know what the inputs are, you can predict the output. So having that different perspective must really change the implementation.
Yeah, I mean, it's critical. And, I spoke about, our why, which is putting digital capability in the hands of users. We do that in two principal areas, and they're not separate areas, they're connected. But let me put it this way. One is to transform the way that defense works as a Department of State. So in that, we're like most other government departments and many large business organizations. So that's, making sure our HR works at machine speed, but with the person, very much at the center of it, making sure our finances and commercial and even our digital processes are 21st century processes and 21st century capability. So that requires people to not just think how defense has always been, but to bring in that industry knowledge, to bring in that wider understanding of other government departments. And if you like, to think of ourselves as rather more normal as a department than we often do. So I think we tend to think of, in defense, we've always thought we're 80% difference and 20% the same. Actually, I think in many ways, we're probably 80% the same and 20% different. And by being 80% the same as other government departments, we can probably speed up an awful lot. We can probably take advantage of some of the best practices you find out in other government departments. We can be better partners across government ourselves. And probably when we do need to be different, because every department needs to be different, and boy, we are different in some ways, but that 20% of difference we'll probably get more credit for. The other bit of diversity, of course, is in pursuit of battle space transformation. And of course, strategic command, who we sit inside, the key theme there is the integrated operating concept and multi-domain integration. And of course, there you really do need that diversity of thought. So multi-domain integration, which my shorthand for that is making us greater than, making the whole greater than the sum of its parts. But that's not just across the 5 military domains of, maritime, land, air, space, and cyber. That's also with partners across government, so particularly the intelligence agencies and other national security players, but also with our allies across the world, our multinational partners across the world, and very importantly with industry. Because, the idea that defense with a capital D is just people who wear uniform or just people who are civil servants or crown servants is for the birds in the 21st century. Defense has to be a much more integrated pursuit, and it has to be integrated between government and industry and indeed academia. You mentioned AI. Academia has an absolutely critical role to play across the digital sphere, and of course, noble think tanks like RUSI, who dot somewhere between academia and industry, I find, but have a critical role to play, and not least in holding us to account and making us think smarter. Yeah. So I think that's the importance of diversity in sort of all of those bits of the why.
It really brings in that almost gives you that timeline between the comprehensive approach, the fusion approach, and as it goes forward. What I think we all find really heartening is when we hear about these things, and we hear about and we join those dots up. What is this actually doing in terms of tactical action? How is digital transformation translating into action at the most basic individual level?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Of course, it is the question, because in terms of changing people's behavior, in terms of flipping them from, industrialization to digitization, then to digitalization, that, of course, generals saying things or senior civil servants saying things or admirals saying things is an important guide to where we want their behaviors to be, but it doesn't necessarily change people's behaviors overnight, our wise words. So putting people in different situations with different tools and showing them there's not just a way of doing things better, but a way of doing better things, which is that real transformational flip, is key to that. So to answer your question, I mean, a huge range of things. And, I've said before at RUSI actually that, we don't have an innovation problem in defense. We have an innovation adoption and an innovation scaling problem across defense. So in every single service, in every bit of defense, even the enabling organizations, as well as the Army, Navy, Air Force, and, the National Cyber Force and elsewhere, there are all number of little widgets being developed or new techniques being developed. I often use the example of a sergeant in my regiment, the Rifles, who's been working with DNS recently. And he, with a couple of coders, has created a brilliant little tool that we can strap, and that's not a technical word, strap onto the side of a rifle or a pistol, and it can give firers immediate feedback on their shooting. And because it's got a bunch of accelerometers in it, a bit like your iPhone does, it can tell them whether they're jerking on the trigger or whether they're squeezing too hard with their right hand or left hand, and so on and so forth. So really instant feedback. Now, that some might think that's a rather trivial example, but where I come from, shooting is quite important for maintaining your health. And of course, deterring bad people from wanting to shoot at you. There's nothing like a round going over your head to keep it down. So there are innumerable widgets, and of course, that's a very tactical example. Some of the stuff that Navy's doing with some of its procurement and sustainment models. Some of the stuff we're doing in complex weapons. I could go on all day, frankly. So there is lots of new capability getting in the hands of users. The trick for us is how we scale that and how we provide the connective tissue that allows our data to flow, not just within the maritime domain, within the Navy, for instance, or within the land domain, but allow that data to flow across domains and then be exploited both at the edge and the core. And really, my job, you can probably tell I'm really excited by the edge stuff, by the tactical stuff. But my job here is to provide those strategic connective tissue elements that allow us to scale those innovations across the whole enterprise. And that's really where our digital strategy comes in, the backbone to give us access to the data. And then the digital foundry, an ecosystem of innovation and development teams around defense, connecting them up and giving them the tools, the hosting, the compute power, and of course, the ways of working, the commercial staff, the finance staff, etc., so that when they're developing software-enabled capability, they don't feel like they're sort of inventing software for the first time in their lives. That the idea is to give them the foundations so they can do their best work without having to worry about those foundational levels, and therefore they can be much quicker, much more agile, dare I say it, and get value to the user, whether that be a sort of a rifleman in a trench or a civil servant in Whitehall, get value to the user much quicker.
Which really places, and when you think about the integrated operating concept, as you were talking about earlier, it really places defence digital at the heart of that. And when we think about how joined up we want to be and how disunited we've been in the past, and just one thought off the top of my head was the fact that the landing platforms weren't fitted with bowmen, so they couldn't talk to the infantry going ashore or what have you, and vice versa, talking to the air. And so when you pull all of that together and you think about this as the fundamental infrastructure for the integrated operating concept, when that talks about protect, engage, constrain below the warfighting threshold, what realistic role does defence or digital transformation as a function in its own right have within that?
Yeah. So where do I start? Let's start with information as a weapon in its own right. So clearly, the past couple of decades have seen this extraordinary democratization of data and information. And its weaponization, often very effectively by our adversaries, whether they be states or non-states. That democratization of information, that availability of information, and the ability for anybody with a social media feed to become a sort of editor and a content producer in their own right, has changed, I mean, almost every facet of our lives, whether it's the way politics is done, even the way religion is done in some cases, but certainly the way business is done, the way we meet our partners, the way we buy stuff, the way we get entertained. I could go on. That's ripping up almost every facet of life. And of course, because it's ripping up politics, it's ripping up conflict, because that's an extension of politics. So clearly, how we provide digital capability, whose lifeblood is data, it's that simple. Data is the blood that flows through our digital capabilities, and that data gets assembled into information, and that information is either what the Russians, and I'm not necessarily the greatest fan of the Russians, but I like some of their thinking. They would talk about information psychological and information technical. And here we're really in the realm of information psychological. So how you use information to impact on people's understanding, on their perception, and ultimately going back to your point earlier about their behavior. How do you change people's behavior by the way you feed them information and how you get them to focus on things? And the way you change people's behavior could be about, from my childhood, how you got people to wear seatbelts in cars, which will seem a very strange thing for you for me to focus on, but that was a huge behavioral change that people achieve really through information. How you get people to stop smoking has been a much more recent campaign that's been pretty successful. And of course, using information as a weapon is very similar in that. How do we get people to change their behavior and get them to do what we want them to do rather than what they necessarily set out to do? And that's really, you're in the realm of deterrence and sub-threshold conflict. And you'll know that the IOPSI speaks about deterrence in a much broader expanse than we've thought about deterrence in the past, and really looks at that action below the threshold of conflict. And I always remind people, below the threshold is where we want to be. Sometimes we talk about it as if it was a bit of a pain that we're below the threshold. As a soldier who's seen a bit of above the threshold, I can assure you it's better that we keep them below the threshold. And part of that is engaging, and constraining below the threshold. Part of that is being very clear that if we go above the threshold, we're still very credible, very lethal, and they want to be below the threshold too, because that's they understand that. And I think most of our adversaries do understand that very clearly. So I suppose that's the first thing I'd focus on: information as a weapon in its own right. And clearly, Defence Digital is in the business of bringing information to all of our users, whether our users are the sort of battle space operators, or indeed some of our users are the enemy and are our adversary. And we need to make sure those capabilities are there, that we can reach out and communicate with them and touch them, if you like, through the cyber domain or the spectrum. So that's the first thing. The second thing, I spoke about the importance of keeping people below the threshold, and therefore having a very credible war fighting response that convinces people they don't want to get above that threshold. And clearly digital capability there has a hugely important, not just enabling role, but critically enabling role to make more of what we've got. And I talk about digital capability broadly in terms of the 3 A's, because I'm a simple soldier. And I talk about analysis, the bit that helps us make better, faster decisions. I talk about automation, which helps the human brain, replaces the human brain in some processes, and speed up to machine speed some relatively simple thought processes, because that's where automation is at the moment. It's in relatively simple areas, but we can remove the human brain from some of those processes and thereby speed them up within constraints. And then autonomy, which is a much more complex area, particularly as you start introducing robotics into it. So there you're potentially enhancing not just humans' brains, but also their bodies, and in some cases replacing humans in that activity, whether that's a self-driving tank or indeed a plane that flies itself or is flown remotely by other human beings. So those 3 A's are critical to making better, faster decisions, to being much more agile, including being agile below the threshold to above the threshold and back down, which is a critical part of the IOPSI. And then lastly, but very importantly for a small island nation, they're critical in regaining mass. And for a small island nation with a fixed population, all 3 of those, analysis, automation, and autonomy, are going to be absolutely critical for maximizing the mass we have available, which still counts above the threshold. So I'd point to those two main things: the sort of information as a weapon, and that ability to enable our warfighting capability to make sure we make the most of the mass we have.
With my historian's head on and looking back at British strategic history, it's almost as if you're taking a step back in time to the good old bad old days of walking softly but carrying a big stick, and having that using that dispersed presence, which purely because we don't have the mass in terms of personnel anymore, you've got mass in terms of other systems, to make that difference. And as you say, hopefully constrain your opponents enough that they don't want to compete above the threshold, don't want to go into that end state of competition, which is so destructive. When we look at that, and we look at the analysis, the automation, and the autonomy of it, is there any work being done on the ethical side of that from your perspective, or is that something that you're very much waiting for others to take the lead on?
No, not at all. There's lots being done on that. And as you probably know, we have an AI strategy that'll be out later, in the next few months, not quite sure when, that will lay out an ethical framework for the adoption and employment of AI across, the multiple use cases. And of course, people tend to fixate on lethal autonomous weapon systems, the killer robots. Well, they are, not through our employment, but they are, I would predict going to be a thing we have to think very, very deeply about. But I rather wish we'd spend slightly less time worrying about that and slightly more time thinking about what I would call the lower moral hazard use cases. I know that's quite a mouthful, but the use cases that aren't quite so, that people don't make films about, but to me have still quite significant moral hazard attached to them and are real-time issues for us now that we still need an ethical framework to think through. And, as a soldier, as an infantryman, there hasn't been a time in my military career, and I include the cadets in this, since I was a teenager, where ethics wasn't part of every single calculation you made. Even in the section battle drills I learned on a rugby pitch when I was 13 years old, ethics were actually, I didn't realize it at the time, absolutely built into that. In terms of our physical fighting and, what was proportionate, what was necessary, and how we went about our business, that was sewn in. And frankly, that's really important. I mean, not least for somebody who's lived the sort of 20 or 30 years that I've lived, it helps you sleep at night, that the decisions you made. And, I've made mistakes, but that you did everything you could to make the best decision and minimize harm to those who didn't deserve harm being forced upon them. It's really important. And so I feel that very powerfully. And that's exactly the approach we need to take to artificial intelligence. And there are an awful lot of things we need to get our heads around at the same time as we prepare ourselves to deal with lethal autonomous weapon systems. Now, fortunately, so good question, well timed. Tomorrow I'm spending all day at Shrivenham at a seminar set up by DGJFD, so Director General Joint Force Development, and his team at Shrivenham. And remember, at Shrivenham, you have both the Defence Academy, the staff colleges, but also the Defence Concepts and Doctrine Centre. So perfectly placed, the brain of UK defence in many ways. And Air Marshal Windy Gale, leading that seminar tomorrow, will be spending a whole day looking at the issues around ethics of AI and data in the round. So, an awful lot of thinking going on there. And I'd say an awful lot of thinking going on nationally too. And so and bilaterally with the US and increasingly in NATO as well. So we're hooked into all of the relevant think tanks that are looking at existential risks and long-term risks. I mean, to the globe and to humanity, because quite rightly, these are very, very profound philosophical and practical problems that we have to wrestle with. Luckily, my job in this is to wrestle with the practical problems. But it really helps if you've got a sort of philosophical wrap to that to sort of help you think through the really difficult bits and make sure your practical considerations are, grounded, but are rooted in deep thinking and in this case, I'm not the one having to do the deep thinking. I'm the one having to do the practical application. But I think you'll gather I take this very, very seriously from my experience in the physical world, that we must get the ethics of AI right to win, but to win well.
I love how you brought it back to the very practical application, and from my own time down at Lympstone on the Commando Ethics program, it's one of the things that we were trying to do there, which was bring it back to the tactical and say, look, the reason you pop smoke, go left, go right, you make those decisions. It's not just the tactical side of it. You have a philosophy, a moral philosophy, which emphasizes certain things, and taking that decision cycle back to actually, why am I thinking that way in the first? I found that really fascinating.
Dead on. And sorry, I mean, just to develop on that, I mean, you'll be aware of the national security study that was done by Bob Work and Eric Schmidt, so former deputy SecDef Bob Work, and I think it's he who keeps coming back to, and this is strategic tactical, if you like. So this is away from the battle space, but it's still about practical application. And Secretary Work is very powerful on this, where he says, remember, the contest in data, the contest in AI will be as much a contest of values as it is as of technology or data. And so embedding that in our thought processes, in our data sets, in our algorithms, in the processes by which we operationalize AI and exploit AI will be critically important, because, ultimately this century, we have to offer people a choice between, what some have called surveillance authoritarianism or similar, and a more liberal and free approach to running our countries and the world. And so that's going to be a really, really important part of what we do. And there couldn't be anything much more important for UK in particular to show a lead on. I think we've got a really good history here, and we've got some really, really good academic institutions that are at the forefront of this across the world. And I think it's a really good chance for us to show a lead, within Strategic Command, but across UK defence.
That's really heartening to know. Really heartening to know, because it's one of those things that does exercise minds. I'm just going to step back a second. You said earlier that the AI strategy, but also the data and AI strategies are due out soon. Where are we with that with the architecture for the digital backbone? And will we see an SRO focal point contractor for end-to-end system integration across MDI, or is that something that's going to be later? Or
so that's a big question. So firstly, the data strategy is out, published on gov.uk for the sharp-eyed amongst you. With the digital strategy, we've deliberately published in the open, despite some people's sort of concern about that. But one of the great things I've learned from digital teams, and Caroline Bellamy was very strong on this, our chief data officer, is that we must publish in the open, because industry is desperate to see this and understand what we're trying to do. So they're out. The AI strategy will be out later in the year, as I say. But I mean, I anticipate in the next month or so. I just don't have an exact date today. To your point about architecture of the digital backbone, so it kind of depends which bit of architecture you mean. I don't think there's going to be a single SRO for the totality of our enterprise architecture. But I would break that down into a couple of different things. So clearly the lead for what many people would think of as the business architecture. How do we want to fight? How do we want to operate? And how do we want to run the business of defense? An integrated operating model, if you like, not just an integrated operating concept. Clearly that sits up at Stratcom level with head office and of course with the other frontline commands to describe how we're going to operate below the threshold and fight above the threshold across those domains, but with our other government department partners and allies. And that is, if you like, the highest level of architecture, that is, how we're going to operate and fight. Within Defence Digital, we then pick up those guidance points, and that's being looked after in the multi-domain integration change program by their design authority, which General Rob McGowan's been developing. We'll then pick up that, how do you want to operate and fight? And then beneath that, build a sort of the common technology architectures that will underpin that. And as Caroline Bellamy would remind me at this stage, the information architectures that the common technology architecture must serve. And again, that's coming on really quite well. So there'll be I'm not sure what we're going to call it yet, but a common technology architecture strategy will be published over the next few months. That's a hugely complex bit of work. I mean, millions of endpoint devices across a network or series of networks is probably, one of the largest and most complex socio-technical things in Europe, I would say. So John Fitzpatrick and his team are working on that. And with a series of in-house architects and, of course, outsourced solutions architects in particular working on that. We've just onboarded John Linwood to come in as a transformation advisor. So many of you know him from CIO of the BBC, to give us some sort of enhanced technical acuity in that area. And that'll be rolled out over the next few months. But that is such a complex bit of work. I can see the PowerPoint slide in front of me now, detailing how many different elements there are, right out to weapons platform level, but also into our core networks, into our APIs, how we see cloud architecture developing. A single SRO, I guess, is John Fitzpatrick in that particular case. But I'll have to check my governance slides to see whether that's right or not. But that's the real answer. The common technology architecture as a bit of that architecture, is coming on well. Hugely complex bit of work, but coming on well.
It's good to know that it is all progressing and it is all getting out there. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it there because we are out of time. But I'm certain that we could go on for quite some time talking about this. And what is actually the fundamental to transformation in the 21st century. When we talk about adaptation in the military, we often talk about these vast revolutions in military affairs, and actually the military revolution evolution is really where you see things progress. So Major General Copinger-Symes, thank you very much for all of that. It's been a quick canter through, but it's been fascinating to you speak and to lay out the stall, as it were. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you.
A Call to Arms is part of the Military Sciences Profession of Arms programme. The show is produced by Pepe Van Arnen and Chris Jones and is sponsored by Airbus. If you enjoyed the show, please rate it and leave a review. Your feedback helps us tailor future interviews to what you, our audience, want to know. RUSI is a membership organisation, and it is thanks to our members and sponsors that we are able to maintain our independence, challenge orthodoxy, and deliver groundbreaking thought leadership. If you consider yourself to be connected to the profession of arms, then perhaps membership is for you. You can find more information at rusi.org/membership. For less than the price of a good cocktail each month, you can join a growing global community with exclusive access to events, research, and insights that put you ahead of your peers. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to welcoming you back next month for more from A Call to Arms.